a while back, I made a video on X-Men Evolution. It did well, really well in fact. I mean, this is almost definitely because I released it right after two of my best performing videos ever, and it rode to success on their algorithmic hype, but I'm gonna completely ignore this and pretend it did well because there's a big audience for content on this show. The thing is, it was also a fairly controversial video. My main conclusion in that video was that while enjoyable to watch, with a handful of standout characterizations and ideas, the show was never able to fully seize the potential of its premise, the high school alternative universe take on the X-Men world. The show seemed reluctant to approach the central metaphorical potency of the X-Men, their symbolic representation of marginalized communities. And in the handful of moments in which it did attempt to tackle these themes, it didn't do anything to further the metaphor, despite the immensely fertile ground provided on this front by the high school setting. But a fair amount of viewers seemed to disagree with my assessment, or at the very least felt that I was focusing too much on the show's start. And while I stand by my earlier conclusion, I'll concede that there's definitely enough interesting stuff past the early period I highlighted in that video to warrant more appreciation and focus than I gave. Because the show does change, it gets wider and wider in scope, and it even abandons a good deal of its early identity come seasons 3 and 4. And it's this change, this metamorphosis that I want to talk about today. When people discuss evolution online, a common sentiment I've seen is something along the lines of, well, yeah, it starts off a little slow, with all that school stuff, but the apocalypse story and the way it builds up to it is great. And I don't have a problem at all with this take. I think most people would agree, in fact. But let's look at it for a second, because it's very easy to gloss over how unusual a progression this is. This orthodox opinion on evolution's slow start openly presupposes the same general point I made last time, that the school setting was never fully utilized. But more interestingly, it takes for granted the way that this show essentially rips up its own premise and soft reboots itself. This might sound hyperbolic, but I'll go into why and how I think we see this in Evolution's second and third seasons, and why plenty of viewers never noticed this pivot happen. So what happens between the first season of this show, a relatively low-stakes story mainly revolving around the X-Men trying to handle the pressures of school while keeping their mutant cover intact, and the last season, which is a far more serialized tale about the secret mutant war against the ancient threat of apocalypse? Well, quite a lot happens, actually. We get the first hints of the show's desire to reinvent itself at the end of season 1, with a two-part finale which teases seismic change, even transforming Cyclops into an aging rock star. But by the end of the episode, the vast majority of these changes are reversed when the mutation machine is destroyed. All that remains is Mystique's redesign, and even this is toned down going forwards. It's a similar story with the season 2 opener, which sees the setting of the show well and truly shaken up as the Brotherhood expose themselves and the X-Men to the whole school. But surprise surprise, a big old reset button gets hit at the end through Professor X's mind-wiping abilities. There's a few other interesting bits and bobs we see in this episode, like the reappearance of Mystique as supposedly English student Risty Wilde.
I'm Risty Wilde, from Manchester, England.
I'm Rogue. Hang out afterwards, I'll show you where Barton's class is.
I mean, side note, it's this point exactly at which it becomes entirely clear that Risty isn't who she says she is. First, people from outside the US don't do that American thing of naming a city and then immediately stating which country it's in. Like, if you're from Los Angeles, you're not going to say you're from Los Angeles, USA. Buy that same ticket, someone from Venice wouldn't say Venice, Italy. Someone from Caracas wouldn't say they're from Caracas, Venezuela. So yeah, Manchester, England? Imposter detected. Plus, not to linger on a completely unimportant point or anything, but the nail in the coffin here is the accent. No one from Manchester has ever spoken like this in all of human history.
Excuse me, how long do these assemblies usually last?
This is how Mancunians sound.
And the guy goes, "So, who are you?" And we're like, "Oasis." And he goes, "Never heard of you." I'm like, "Ah, clever boy."
This is such a shoddy impersonation from Mystique. It's like if someone with a deep South accent tried to tell you they were born and raised in New York City, and then specified they were talking about New York City in the US of A. And now that I've given that clearly very important point the attention it deserves, there's one more interesting point we see in this Season 2 premiere. And that's the new principal of the school, Edward Kelly. In most X-media, Robert Kelly is a bigoted senator responsible to some degree for the public hatred of mutants, and sometimes playing a key role in the development of dystopic futures such as Days of Future Past. But here he's a high school principal. The show takes some of the classic aspects of the character, like his distrust for mutants and his opposition to the X-Men, and places them into this altered version. In many ways he's more or less standard Kelly, but in miniature. In a show where the X-Men aren't a global force of mutant power so much as a high school clique, downgrading Kelly to a faculty member sort of preserves a similar balance of power between the two. But the trajectory of Kelly in this series speaks, I think, to a core tension behind the scenes of X-Men Evolution. The show can't quite decide if it wants to be an example of the well-known high school AU trope, link to more on this in the description, or simply an origin series implicitly leading to a mostly standard X-Men continuity. Because towards the end of Evolution, we see Kelly running for mayor. This seems to position him in the perfect place to become, in the next decade or so, a facsimile of the classic Senator Kelly character, all with a pre-existing rivalry with the X-Men and bigoted attitude towards mutants already set up. The way the show maneuvers this character from a small-scale figure in a school-based X-Men reboot to someone poised to become the classic version of the character is an example of this overall shift I think we see in the middle years of Evolution. A little later in Season 2 we get another indication of this metamorphosis, and this comes in the episode Mind Bender. For most of its runtime, nothing about this one feels out of the ordinary. It's just the X-Men tracking down and beating off a telepath who's managed to take control of some of their ranks. But at the very end of this episode, it becomes clear that this is different. Because we see the telepath Mesmero taking the key he'd stolen in this episode to a hidden, ominous-looking chamber. We find out that this key isn't just a harmless MacGuffin, but one of the 3 keys necessary to free Mesmero's master, Apocalypse. And that's it, for ages. This plot thread isn't picked up properly until the middle of Season 3, and it doesn't pay off fully until that season's 2-part finale. That's like twice as far into this show's run as when this plotline was introduced, which represents a pretty ballsy commitment to long-form storytelling. And I think this gradual widening of the X-Men's world is the central reason the show can change its focus so much between seasons 1 and 4 in a way that feels seamless. It reframes the show from a fairly cozy affair with limited scope to a worldwide race to stop Apocalypse's return, because introducing Mesmero and his quest for the keys so early results in a prolonged sense of dramatic irony. For those of you who fell asleep in English class, dramatic irony is a storytelling technique where you give the audience more information than the characters have themselves, and we see this in Evolution for like an entire season, because after seeing this plot thread dangled in Season 2, the audience knows something big is on the horizon. Especially if they already know who Apocalypse is from the 90s show or from the comics or wherever. But even if they don't, the show goes back to focus on the travails and tribulations of the X-Men and the Brotherhood and their social lives, and even introduces threats like the Sentinels. But we, the audience, know that while all this other stuff is going on, in the background there's another story playing out, with far bigger stakes than anything in the foreground. As a result of this dynamic, instead of being fully wrapped up in storylines which might have felt hugely significant had they happened in Season 1, like the world being exposed to mutants, or the introduction of Scarlet Witch, or the girls in the X-Men and Brotherhood teaming up to fight crime as the Bayville Sirens, an episode which, by the way, has an extended music video style montage in the middle. Yeah, super 2000s. But instead of being fully wrapped up in any of the stuff like this, and being invested mostly into things like the will they won't they of Jean and Scott, or the mutants' rivalry with Principal Kelly, the spectre of Apocalypse lingering in the shadows of this world means that inevitably, part of every viewer is craving answers, or a resolution to that side of things, and it doesn't come for ages. So in the meantime, the small-scale stuff gets less engrossing, and when the show does pull back a little and widen its world out, with episodes introducing Captain America, S.H.I.E.L.D., Hydra, Kang, and yes, eventually teasing the future of the Apocalypse storyline, these bigger stakes stories become more satisfying because they're breadcrumbs being dropped bit by bit, and we're hungry for them. By the time that we get more into the Apocalypse stuff, like the fun little episode where we get the X-Men and Brotherhood racing to steal a tablet from a London museum, the school stuff, the social dynamics, the hallmarks of Season 1 have largely been dropped. Hell, even Spike, the show's first major original character, disappears from the show in the weirdest and most sudden exit since Poochie the Space Dog.
But we can help you through this. Please don't worry about me, or look for me. I'm with friends. Goodbye, Auntie O.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
For instance, we only see Bayville High properly in Season 3 twice. That's a pretty insane shift from this series' earlier days. And the last time we see it in Season 3, Jean and Cyclops are graduating. We've barely seen any of their final year, and I don't even think we knew it was their final year. And then we just rock up to their graduation. And as the title of this video might suggest, I think this is indicative of the overall shift Evolution had been gradually making since the start of Season 2. Because by this point, Evolution had sort of graduated itself. Sure, we see little snatches of school stuff in Season 4, but a lot of this is in the Xavier Institute. By this point, Evolution is, for all intents and purposes, done with Bayville High. It's abandoned the secret X-Men in high school trope, which underpinned the majority of its first season, and it's now telling a bigger story with bigger stakes. If the trajectory of the show's first season had carried on, if the writing team hadn't gradually shifted the focus to a wider world, I think this alternative version of the show would look quite different. Maybe Gambit and Colossus would still appear, but as transfer students. Maybe we get some action in Egypt with Apocalypse, but on a school trip. Stuff like that. I don't know, I'm spitballing here. The sad part for me about this shift, the way Evolution graduates from its school setting, is that one of the only real episodes which seems at all concerned with rehearsing any kind of interesting real-world allegory with mutanthood is the other school episode in Season 3. So just when the show is starting to do something with the setting, that setting is being phased out. And sure, it's hardly anything groundbreaking, it's more of the antiquated civil rights parallels, with Bayville High becoming a reflected version of all that business in Little Rock, Arkansas. But at this point, it's clear that this is all the show's willing to give us. There's certainly none of that hip new gay rights stuff, which was at the centre of the Fox X-Men films at the time, given the way Episode 21 downright fillets normative Judeo-Christian morality and belief. But even the token gesture towards a politically conscious X-Men series is snatched away in the abandoning of the show's early identity, and that's a shame. Look, it's beyond doubt that this shift, this metamorphosis from a small-scale high school AU X-Men series that we see in Season 1 to the continent-hopping grand mystery of Apocalypse's return, was a good thing for the show. It delivered a gripping narrative and pushed the show's cast of characters to new and interesting places, both metaphorically and literally. All I'm saying here in this video is that this shift, the way Evolution graduates from its own premise, isn't as obvious a move as it appears to be in retrospect, and that there might have been some casualties of potential along the way. So the next time you're watching or rewatching Evolution, pay attention to the dynamics of this shift in premise, because the way it's accomplished is pretty fascinating. You might be wondering at this point why I've talked a whole lot more about the build-up to Season 4 than I have about Season 4 itself, and there is a reason for that. I think Season 4 is intriguing enough to warrant its own video. Maybe it won't be quite as long as this one, maybe it will, who knows. So subscribe if you want to be alerted if and when I make that one. Otherwise, let me leave you with this. There's a scene in Season 2 where Professor X alters Nightcrawler's image inducer a little, and the result is, well, see for yourself.
Ma'am? What's that supposed to mean?
And all I have to say on this matter is,
Them Nightcrawler bussy got me acting up.
I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.